In this world, power is determined not by talent or effort, but simply by eye color. And if you have the wrong color, you can forget about a bright future. There once was a mage named Abel, a man with power so great that even his allies feared him. And in search of an ideal world, he decided to take an extreme step, transferring his soul to a distant future. It seemed like a chance to start over, but reality turns out to be ironic. Because in this new era, his eyes, once a symbol of power, are now called the eyes of the inferior, turning him from a legend into a laughingstock. The aristocrats hunt him, look down on him, and the world system itself places him at the bottom. But there is one detail that no one imagines. As this world bets on technology and forgets magic, his amber eyes hide a power that goes far beyond human comprehension. And to be honest, it is precisely this type of protagonist who ends up changing the rules of the game. This content is an original narrative retelling by the channel's author, created with a distinct style, structure, and focus. It does not reproduce the original material literally, and constitutes a transformative work. A man had been sleeping for 200 years. When he awoke, he found that a woman had been waiting for him all this time. The demon woman claimed she wished to repay a debt of gratitude. He was utterly bewildered, for as he recalled, he had clearly killed the demon king. 200 years ago, Abel stood before everyone and with the very last of his strength, put an end to the demon king's reign. The world was bathed in light, but there was not a hint of warmth in his eyes. Afterward, Ro, the hero who had led his party, went to find him. Ro told him that the world was now at peace, and therefore his amber eyes were no longer needed. In this world, eye color revealed one's magical affinity. Red eyes signified the fire attribute, blue eyes the water attribute, green eyes the wind attribute and his own, a golden amber capable of encompassing all attributes. Those eyes were a sign of supreme power, but they also bore a striking resemblance to those of the demon race. Roy explained that once peace was established, humanity would inevitably turn on itself. When that time came, those eyes would only be seen as an ill omen. They had prepared a villa for him on a secluded island, hoping he would live out his days there in absolute silence and anonymity. Abel's heart sank into an abyss, pierced by a profound sense of betrayal. Years of fighting side by side, and all he had earned was betrayal and exile. He eventually accepted calmly that he would disappear from their sight, but he would never set foot in that beautiful cage. He turned and walked away, yet he felt no hatred towards those he had once called companions. His hatred was reserved for the world, a world that had no place for a pair of amber eyes. Over time, he retreated into the deepest mountains, dedicating his entire existence to forbidden research. For the first time in the history of civilization, he made the magic of reincarnation a reality. A single drop of potion fell upon the coffin, opening a passage to the future. He yearned to travel 200 years forward. He believed it would be a new world, one that could accept amber eyes. He lay quietly within the coffin and let his consciousness sink into the long darkness. Some time later, a surge of power blew the lid off from within. He sat up with difficulty and immediately sensed something strange about his body. His limbs were small and thin, clearly a child's body, having been unused for so long. He struggled to control his power for a moment. It seemed reincarnation had been successful. This was the world 200 years in the future, and his soul had taken up residence in the body of a small child. Regardless, after 200 years, no one would remember what he looked like. Just then, a faint but unmistakable presence immediately put him on high alert. It was the aura of the demon race. It was slowly approaching the cave. Light footsteps, a woman's, perhaps. How had she managed to bypass the barrier? Had the barrier deteriorated so much in 200 years? With this body, he was unsure how much power he could truly wield. The door opened just a crack. That fleeting instant was his only chance. He gathered his magic, determined to strike first with all he had, light concentrated in his palm. But he froze the instant before he was about to release it. He forcefully halted the spell that had nearly escaped him. In the doorway stood a slender young woman. Her face reflected deep astonishment. Not amber, her eyes were a clear, water-like blue. A human. How could she have possibly passed the barrier to get here? The basket the woman carried in her hands fell to the ground with a dull thud. She collapsed onto her knees. Tears welled up without warning, streaming down her beautiful cheeks. She said she had been waiting for this day all this time. Abel was utterly stunned. He didn't recognize the woman before him, but then he saw her wipe away her tears, and suddenly understood everything. 200 years ago, he had taken pity on a young demon girl. He could still hear his companion's furious protests echoing in his ears, but he had protected her nonetheless. Back then, she had wiped away her tears in exactly the same manner. He couldn't help but notice that her tearful disposition hadn't changed one bit. So that little demon girl had grown up after all. He uttered the name he had almost forgotten, Lilith. New tears rolled down her face, but she smiled, confirming that she was indeed Lilith. She said she had spent over 100 years searching to repay the kindness he had shown her. Only after finally finding out the place where his reincarnation rested had she finally made her way there. And as she stood up, Abel realized she only came up to his chest. He smiled sadly, realizing how much his barrier had weakened. But what worried him most was this, that his eyes were no longer the amber color he remembered. That had once been the color of his soul. Had he truly managed to give it up? Lilith offered no explanation. Instead, she brought her hand to her eyes and removed her disguise. Two thin blue discs that had completely changed her eye color. His amber eyes had reappeared. She held up those two colored lenses. Abel was speechless, a rush of complicated emotions surging within him. In the past, countless lives had been wiped out by war because of eye color. So much blood had been shed, all for something that two thin discs could now resolve. Lilith wrapped a warm scarf around him, pulling him out of his thoughts. She had prepared a home nearby and intended to get him out of that freezing cave. As they exited the cave, an icy wind whipped at their faces. He gazed at the distant village. He could only imagine how long she had been waiting for this day. The new home was filled with things he had never seen before. The light bulbs that glowed. In particular, it filled him with curiosity, but the private study warmed his heart even more. Lilith knew reading was his greatest passion, and it was also the fastest way to understand this new era. He thanked her sincerely, after all. 200 years ago, books were extraordinarily valuable and scarce. He immersed himself in the sea of books, trying to make sense of this unfamiliar new world. According to the texts, most of the energy in this era came from magic stones. The processing of magic stones had driven an explosive leap in civilization. Even light bulbs ran on the energy of magic stones. He imagined that the mages of this era must find it quite easy. He continued reading, but his smile gradually faded. What the books revealed left him stunned. The general level of magic had deteriorated severely. What were now considered powerful spells were the kind any child knew in his time. Worse still, the books openly documented spell runes riddled with errors. Practicing with these methods would only lead to failure, or worse, an explosion. This future world had taken giant leaps in technology, but magic had fallen into a lamentable decline. At that moment, a noise was heard from outside the door, but it wasn't Lilith. The presence was unknown, and Lilith was nowhere to be found. The door swung wide open, and a boy with a snotty nose poked his head in, smiling. The boy asked if he was Lilith's little brother. Abel was bewildered. What on earth was this child talking about? The boy, who called himself Carl, declared with great pomp that he intended to make Abel his subordinate. Abel felt a surge of helpless resignation. Judging by the fine clothes, the boy was clearly of noble birth. He calmly declined the supposed honor, but the boy began to insist and complain, insisting loudly and stubbornly that Abel had no choice but to accept. Driven to his limit, Abel decided to scare the boy off in the most direct way possible. He warned him not to mess with him, and deliberately let him clearly see the color of his eyes. The boy was indeed taken aback. Abel thought his plan had worked. Of course, Chad let out a thunderous laugh. He shouted excitedly that it was the first time he had ever seen the legendary amber eyes. Abel didn't understand why the boy wasn't scared. Just then, an older boy came running to stop his younger brother. Arobes, Chad's older brother, who scolded Chad for bursting into someone else's house. But Chad couldn't wait to point at Abel, eager to share his discovery. Upon seeing Abel's amber eyes, Buzz seemed to understand. He mentioned that Lilith had spoken highly of her brother's extraordinary talent, but his words betrayed barely concealed disappointment upon seeing the reality with his own eyes. Ted leaned in to explain that those amber eyes signified a total inability to adapt to any type of magic. Abel was inwardly stunned. This was the complete opposite of what he knew. Amber eyes required grueling training to unleash their full potential, but once mastered, they could control powerful magic of any attribute. In the past, that power had awakened envy, but it also inspired deep respect. Bash reprimanded his brother for speaking so harshly, but then added a few words of his own. He commented that nowadays, one could live a perfectly happy life without needing any magic at all, and he implied that Abel would be taken care of in a manner befitting his station. Abel was horrified inwardly. They were treating him like someone completely useless. Bass urged his brother to go home and practice his magic. Before leaving, Chad couldn't resist one last sneer at Abel's bird-like eyes. Abel stared at the door as it slammed shut, a wave of absurd helplessness washing over him. At that moment, he suddenly understood the story he had just read. The world had been at peace for a century. The demon race had faded into distant legend. The amber eyes that once reflected those of demons, naturally, no longer inspired fear. In a peaceful era where the general level of magic had declined, eyes whose value was only revealed after years of hard training had become a source of ridicule. From being persecuted in the past to being ridiculed in the present, the simple, ordinary life he yearned for seemed forever out of reach. Just then Lilith returned, pulling him out of his thoughts. Seeing what she was wearing, Abel understood at a glance what she was up to. Lilith gave a slight twirl and asked if it suited her. Abel felt a slight blush creep up his cheeks and honestly replied, yes. His confusion had also dissipated. He understood why she had to hide those amber eyes. In over 200 years, the perception of amber eyes had completely changed. Lilith's expression turned sad. She spoke of how the demon race had declined over those 200 years. Ever since the demon king was defeated by the heroes, the remnants of the demon race had been hunted and exterminated by humans, and the level of mages had also plummeted noticeably. He echoed her words, lamenting that even the truth of the power hidden in amber eyes had been forgotten. He then asked, abruptly, if, as a member of the demon race, she harbored hatred towards humans and towards him. Lilith merely offered a soft smile and shook her head. She recalled how he had gone out of his way to protect her when she was young, wandering everywhere with her on his back. He had not only taught her magic, but also how to survive among humans. She stood up and with a calm yet unshakable determination, voiced the feelings she had long held hidden. She confessed that, for a long time now, she had been deeply, deeply in love with him. She then made a request. In the steam-filled bathroom, she gently rubbed his back. He pointed out, slightly nervously, what a scene like that might imply. She just laughed softly, saying that with his childlike appearance, he wasn't exactly making a convincing argument. Still, the mere fact that he saw her as a woman was more than enough to make her happy. That night they shared the same bed. It was the first time in 200 years, the first time he had fallen into a deep sleep, and with no dreams. In the mornings that followed, he and she ate breakfast together. During the day, he immersed himself in books, soaking up the knowledge of this era. But every afternoon, the peace was abruptly interrupted by an unwanted guest. Ted, the noble son, would barge in, demanding a playmate. He had no time for children, and was constantly devising ways to escape. One day, he walked directly to the window and cast a simple spell under Chad's gaze. With wide eyes and an open mouth, he leaped lightly onto the neighbor's rooftop. It wasn't even a fraction of his former skill, but it was more than enough to impress. Chad's competitive spirit was instantly ignited. Indeed, he tried to gather his own magic and jump out the window. His body wobbled unstably, barely lifting off the ground. His magic sputtered out uncontrollably and without control. Abel immediately recognized the problem. That kind of control could never be sustained. Indeed, Chad's magic ran out. He screamed and tumbled into the bushes below. Abel leaped down to check on him, but Chad, embarrassed and furious, suddenly lunged at him. Abel stepped on his back and used it as a springboard to leap aside. Ted crashed headfirst into the wall. Seeing the boy clutching his nose in pain, Abel found himself thinking that the boy took hits well. With 20 years of training, he might become a pretty decent mage. Ted became enraged at this and accused his subordinate of having the audacity to speak to him that way. Abel calmly denied being anyone's subordinate, but then an idea suddenly struck him. He immediately changed his mind, saying that, after all, he would be willing to be Chad's subordinate. Ted lit up with joy, but Abel said there was one condition. He thought of the warm scarf Lilith had gifted him. He told Chad that if he could snatch the scarf from him before sundown, he would gladly acknowledge Chad as his older brother. Chad thought it easy and agreed immediately. Abel, however, had his own plans in mind. As this young noble lord was going to interrupt his reading every day anyway, he might as well use him as an excellent physical training partner. Ted lunged after him with burning determination. Abel leaped onto the rooftop. That maneuver further fueled Chad's competitive spirit. He also lunged in a jump and awkwardly crashed into the wall. Abel smiled inwardly. The difference between them was astronomical, but Chad tried again, and this time he succeeded. He began to chase him in earnest. This surprised Abel somewhat. This time, Chad wasn't using enhancement magic. He relied solely on his own physical ability. As Abel dodged him, he calmly assessed his ordinary-looking pursuer, and he didn't seem particularly perceptive, with no hint of intellectual presence. Only his endurance and sheer persistence were noteworthy. Chad lost his balance on the rooftop again and fell face first. He demanded to know why Abel wasn't even the least bit tired. Abel deliberately asked him if he was looking for an excuse to give up, as expected. Those words caused Chad to lunge after him again. But in Abel's eyes, his movements were painfully slow. Eventually, Chad became completely exhausted and collapsed onto the ground. Still, the fact that he had lasted 20 minutes was more than Abel had expected. He turned to return to his study, ready to end this charade. But as he passed the window, he caught a glimpse of Lilith. She was inside talking to young Master Bass. Abel discreetly cast a spell to sharpen his hearing. He heard Lilith politely, but firmly reject whatever Bass had proposed. Ba instantly became enraged and shouted at her, asking what could possibly be unsatisfactory. It seemed that a young noble with a fragile ego, as expected, was the type of person who found it hardest of all to accept rejection from a woman. But Lilith calmly explained that her refusal had nothing to do with dissatisfaction. It was simply because her heart already belonged to someone else. Those words caused even Abel, who was eavesdropping outside, to freeze for a moment. Boz gritted his teeth. He asked if that person was her brother, Abel. Lilith remained silent for a moment, then with a smile admitted that he was. Abel was utterly stunned, feeling a storm of emotions churn within him. Boz trembled with rage, hurling insults and calling her shameless. To think she had fallen for her own brother. Upon hearing the word shameless, Abel's gaze turned icy. After all, he was not Lilith's brother in the slightest, but the pretense of being siblings was the most convenient disguise they had for now. Boz's unpleasant words were certainly unpleasant to hear, but he had just been roundly rejected. His pathetic state made Abel decide to look away. From that day on, Ted became a constant little shadow that followed Abel around. Playing with the young noble had, somehow, become a fixed part of his daily routine. After a few days of observation, Abel realized something. Although Jack had fiery eyes fit for casting a tribute spell, he lacked the complex reasoning required to sustain high-level elemental spells. That instinctive talent for reading and constructing runes in an instant, he clearly did not possess. However, Abel also discovered a different talent in him. When it came to physical enhancement magic, Chad had an extraordinary natural intuition and aptitude. This type of magic, which didn't require relying on logic, might be perfect for him. Chad lunged at him again. Brimming with excitement, Abel realized that in just a few days, the boy had made tangible progress. Just then, Buzz saw them through the window, his gaze fixed rigidly on the two figures on the rooftop. Abel effortlessly deflected the hand Chad extended towards him, remarking indifferently that his movements were too slow. Chad stumbled onto the rooftop and slid through the snow for a good stretch. He quickly got to his feet, frustration painted on his face, but his foot slipped, and he lost his balance completely. He screamed as he tumbled over the edge and hit the ground hard. Tears welled up in Char's eyes in an instant. Abel immediately jumped down, assessed the situation, and suspected a fracture. And he began to cast a healing spell, but at that moment, Baze lunged at him. Roaring, he shoved Abel with all his might, knelt beside his brother, and declared that he himself would perform the recovery spell. Abel was slightly surprised. Could someone without gray eyes cast healing magic? But the green magical light rising from Bass's hands made Abel's eyes sharpen. At first glance, it seemed quite convincing, but Chad's screams of pain grew louder and louder. Abel immediately sensed that something was very wrong. Correct bone setting was like building with blocks. You always start with the large pieces that serve as a base. Caro Bass was doing the opposite, forcing large pieces over small ones. It was merely a superficial illusion of repair. The internal structure was a complete mess. Such a union would have catastrophic consequences. Abel urgently shouted that he needed a doctor to tend to him immediately. But Boz roared back furiously. It was not for a commoner to give him orders. He accused Abel of being responsible for Chad's fall, pointing out that Chad was a noble, the honorable second son of the Langbert family, and hurled repeated insults at Abel, calling him a village trash with inferior eyes. He declared that he would never forgive anyone who tarnished the dignity of his noble surname. He drew his longsword and challenged Baz to a duel. Abel froze on the spot, overwhelmed by weary resignation, because Chad was still lying on the ground, groaning in pain. A duel at that moment was hardly the wisest decision, but the commotion had attracted onlookers, making the situation even more difficult to manage. He had no choice but to accept the challenge. Bass announced the rules and magnanimously offered to give him a head start. He rejected his generosity. He just wanted to get this over with. That dismissive indifference was the last straw for Bass's composure. He let out a furious roar and unleashed his prized final technique, a spell called Wind Slash, which tore through the air with tremendous force. Abel effortlessly dodged, and the attack split the large tree behind him in two. He silently assessed that the power was quite decent, but the casting speed was exceptionally fast. In the past, that kind of speed had been achievable by almost no one but himself. However, the opponent before him clearly did not possess that level of skill. The answer must lie in that peculiarly designed sword. Bass let out a mocking smile of triumph and asked if he had never seen a magic tool before. He boasted of the sword's power, claiming it could help create spells. He then swung the sword again, launching another fierce attack. This time, Abel managed to spot the runes on the blade. Everything clicked into place. Baz leaped high into the air, intending to overpower him with sheer force. Abel only felt an overwhelming sense of weariness. With a casual movement, he neutralized the fierce attack with his bare hand. Voss was visibly stunned. Abel understood then. Magic tools were the root cause of Mage's decline. The over-reliance on external devices that made things easier had stripped people of the ability to think for themselves. He decided to end this charade and show this man what true power was like. He concentrated, and the same wind slash took shape in his hands, but its magnitude and strength were light years beyond what it had been before. The devastating windstorm left Ba with nowhere to run. He was blown away and crashed to the ground, and that's with evil already holding back. Ba still refused to surrender, spitting bitter insults. Just then, a flash of skirt appeared without warning before him. Lilith, without warning, delivered a kick, driving it squarely into his face. Ba was sent flying once more. Lilith's voice was ice cold. She slowly said that she could overlook insults directed at her, but she would not tolerate anyone continuing to insult Lord Abel. She looked down at him, her eyes filled with a cold warning. Baze was deathly afraid of that sudden cruelty. Abel had no choice but to intervene and stop Lilith. The doctor declared that Jan would need to rest for half a year. Abel's heart sank. For a boy as lively as Jan, that was nothing short of imprisonment. Standing by the window, Abel listened to the diagnosis with a frown. 6 months was too long. After Chad had fallen asleep, a magic circle for teleportation silently appeared. Abel left, determined to intervene in a more direct manner. He had initially thought to test the medical standards of this era, but now he abandoned that idea. Magic gathered in his hands, enveloping Chad's wounds. First, he erased all traces of Bass's magic. Then, using a much more refined technique, he fused the bones and accelerated the healing. All the while, Ted lay peacefully, lost in sleep. Gazing at his sleeping face, Abel felt a deep wave of guilt wash over him. Before leaving, he whispered softly, "I'm sorry." The next morning, Abel opened the door and found Bass standing there, his head shaved. He barely recognized him and hesitantly called him by his name. Vaz immediately exploded as if he'd been stepped on, enraging but a second later. He received a heavy blow to the back of the head. It was his father, Ivan. He knelt on one knee and apologized for his son's foolish behavior. Vaz couldn't understand why his father was bowing to a mere commoner. He was nothing more than his maid's younger brother. Those words earned him another punch from his father. Ivan finally revealed the truth. It wasn't that his family had hired Lilith, but quite the opposite. It was Lady Lilith, who had been employing his entire family from the beginning. Bass stood frozen, his entire worldview shattered. And Abel, finally, understood that the question that had long intrigued him finally had an answer. He had long wondered why Lilith, a high-ranking demon, maintained such a low profile. It turned out to be the survival wisdom of the demon race living in human society. Externally playing the role of an obedient servant, while in the shadows, she discreetly and skillfully leveraged the power of nobility. After that, Vaz disappeared from the city. It was rumored that he had gone to study at one of the top magic academies. Ivan approached Tari and told him what had happened in the past. When Ivan was young, he had been attacked by a monster in the forest. It was Lilith who appeared like a divine being and saved his life. Afterward, she had supported him in many ways and taught him the knowledge of magic. Regardless of their formal relationship, she was the benefactor and neighbor whom he deeply respected. He told Ted to get along with that pair of siblings. Ted nodded with a smile. He had long considered Abel his best friend. That afternoon, Ted sneaked into Abel's study as usual, but this time he called out to him. "Master," with a beaming smile. Abel turned with a sigh, wondering what mischief the boy had concocted this time. 2 years passed amidst arguments and laughter. It was one of the few moments of leisure in his long life. Abel gradually got used to this world 200 years in the future, and Chad had also put his childishness behind him. His magic had progressed at a remarkable speed. He could now cast fire magic with true skill, and the power behind it was not to be underestimated. Abel watched him with a smile of genuine approval. Ted then invited him to take the entrance exam together the next day. The invitation gave Abel pause for thought. He went to ask Lilith, why does someone who has already reached the pinnacle 200 years ago need to go to school now? But Lilith retorted, if you don't attend the academy, how do you plan to earn a living? He said he would become an adventurer, just as he had done before. But Lilith informed him that the profession of adventurer had been abolished 10 years ago. In peacetime, it was a meaningless profession. She pointed out that, if he wanted to work in any field related to magic, formal education was indispensable. She then added with a teasing smile, are you sure you want to spend your days as her lapdog? Those words finally made him yield and agree to take the exam. The next day, Chad enthusiastically drove through the gates of the kingdom's most prestigious magic academy. Beyond the grand gates, whispers and disdainful glances followed them like shadows. The enrolled students trailing behind them commented on his inferior eyes without even bothering to lower their voices. They mocked how far the academy had fallen to allow someone like him to take the entrance exam. Abel thought the demeanor of those noble children was remarkably poor, but Chad, at his side, was already furious and vehemently took his side. Just then, a clear, sharp female voice rang out and silenced them. She accused them of conspiring to defame someone behind their backs, a behavior totally unbecoming of nobles. Abel turned around and saw a familiar crest gleaming on the girl's chest. He had the feeling he'd seen that emblem somewhere before. The instigators arrogantly demanded to know who she was, and the girl held her head high as she introduced herself. Her name was Elise, and her goal was to become a great mage whose name would resonate throughout history. Confrontation seemed inevitable. The others wanted to teach that presumptuous aspirant a lesson. Elise simply stepped back silently, and then a sword flashed. The sharp tip of her sword pointed directly at them. The movement was clean and swift. Abel thought to himself that her swordsmanship was quite impressive. Elise coldly told them to get out of her sight. The instigators retreated in shame, issuing a threat to save face as they left. Abel felt he should thank her, so he called out to stop her. Elise did not stop. He then reached out to restrain her, but she slapped his hand away with a sharp retort. Elise snapped at Abel that he was merely a commoner and had no business touching her. She made it clear that she simply disdained people who talked behind others' backs. She wasn't here to help a commoner. She turned and walked away, stating that she was only interested in people with true strength. Chad became enraged once more at her arrogance. He shouted that she had no idea what true strength was. Abel, however, watched her retreating figure with the unsettling feeling that he had seen that face somewhere before. Next came the written part of the entrance exam. For Abel, the written exam was ridiculously easy, right up to the final subject, magic engineering, where the difficulty suddenly skyrocketed. That last question was clearly designed to prevent anyone from getting a perfect score. He pondered for a moment, and a smile drew itself onto the corner of his lips. What a ridiculously fitting coincidence, because the person who had deduced that theorem was none other than himself. 200 years ago, when the written exam concluded, they led everyone to an open field. What awaited them next was a practical test on the use of magic tools. The table was covered with magic tools of all sorts. The examiner instructed the candidates to choose based on their eye color. Abel had no expectations. It was unlikely that anything prepared there would suit amber eyes. Calmly, he picked up a red one-handed sword as a substitute. The examiner announced that the targets were made of dark matter that absorbed magic. The candidates were free to unleash their magic as they pleased. Char was the first to raise his hand with enthusiasm, asking to go before the others. Abel couldn't help but feel a pang of concern for him. All those gathered were elites. He feared Chad's half-baked level would make him a laughingstock in front of the crowd. Chad gathered all his strength and shouted as he launched a fireball. But the magic that came out was barely a flicker. Abel felt a surge of frustration and disappointment, clumsy as ever. The weak flicker of magic hit the center of the target and faded without a trace. However, the entire venue erupted in a wave of shock. Abel assumed it was mockery, but to his surprise, the examiner exclaimed with genuine admiration, declaring Chad to possess exceptional talent. The other candidates seemed disheartened, complaining about the pressure of having to follow someone so strong. Abel couldn't believe it. Here, that level was considered truly impressive. The candidates who followed confirmed his suspicion. Their magic was even weaker, like a clumsy performance in a talent show. The target suffered nothing more than a few scratches. When his turn came, the examiner's tone betrayed a wavering note of concern. Abel felt a familiar surge of resignation. The examiner clearly underestimated him due to his amber eyes, but Chad gave him an enthusiastic clap on the shoulder, encouraging him to show everyone what he was made of, and that unconditional confidence and sincerity made a warmth spread through Abel's chest. He picked up the magic tool and took the starting position, countless pairs of eyes from the spectators fixed on his back. Interspersed with whispers, they mocked his slow spell casting, typical of someone with poor eyesight. Abel ignored them, engrossed in thinking of an elegant combination, given that the target was made of dark matter. It was best to go big. He activated his spell Fireball Split Type 2. A torrential surge of magic erupted, shooting towards the sky. Everyone gasped, stunned by its sheer magnitude. Abel thought to himself, this was more than simply big. The sphere of magic rose high into the air, and then plummeted like a firework. As the spectators watched in disbelief, the target was completely engulfed. When the smoke cleared, all that remained was a terrifying crater in the ground. The entire examination hall fell into a deathly silence, and then erupted into an uproar. Much louder than before, Ted jumped for joy, cheering at the top of his lungs. Abel was sure he had just shaken off some of those deeply ingrained prejudices. In another examination room, Elise unleashed her flame slash with a thunderous blow. The blow had considerable power, enough to crack the surface of the dark target. The examiner could barely hide his surprise, and exclamations of awe could be heard from the crowd. However, Elise herself felt nothing but absolute boredom that this so-called elite academy was shaken by something of this level. Just then, an examiner from the adjacent room rushed over. Elise silently sharpened her hearing and caught snippets of the conversation. The keywords were the amber-eyed candidate, and the target was destroyed. Her heart skipped a beat. She immediately thought of the person she had met that morning. A smile of genuine excitement finally drew itself onto the corner of her lips. Things were finally getting interesting. After the exam, Abel obtained an A-class rating. Ted also received an A-class and could barely contain his satisfaction. The two headed to the waiting room reserved for A-class candidates. The room was sparsely populated, but the moment they entered, all eyes turned to them, every gaze fixed on the amber color of Abel's eyes. A murmur spread through the room, and everyone speculated on the rumor that he had destroyed the target. A familiar voice rose from nearby. Elise walked over directly. She asked him directly if the story about the destroyed target was true. She pressed him to explain how the spell had been constructed, suspecting it had been formed by a famous master. Seeing that Abel remained silent, she declared that she would find the answer for herself in the next trial. Examiner Feedy appeared just in time to announce the rules for the final assessment. The format was a simulated duel, simple and straightforward. Two candidates would face off, and whoever had their defense broken first would be the loser. Opponents would be matched according to their performance in the previous rounds. The outcome was no surprise. Abel's opponent was Elise. On the duel grounds, Elise drew her sword with a fluid motion and told him to draw his weapon. Abel replied that he didn't usually resort to magic tools in a fight. Elise laughed and called him old-fashioned. Without hesitation, she charged at him, wielding her sword with blinding ferocity. Abel silently acknowledged that her skills were impressive by the standards of this era. He didn't move, but the moment the blade was about to make contact, he vanished. In an instant, he had appeared behind Elise with natural composure. Elise turned in surprise, but the fighting spirit in her eyes burned even brighter than before. She gathered her magic again, and flames fiercer than ever blazed along her sword. A second flame slash roared out with even greater force. This time, Abel had no intention of merely dodging it. With a wave of his hand, he conjured the same fire element spell, but the magic sustaining it was far more intense and violent. Elise didn't expect it at all. She found herself completely lost, unsure how to counter it. Her mind went blank. The next second, the two magical forces collided in the air with a thunderous roar. A blinding burst of light expanded outward, engulfing everything. As the roar subsided, smoke swirled, and a terrifying crater had been gouged into the ground. Abel extended his senses, but could detect no trace of his opponent. A flicker of regret shot through him, worried if he had gone too far. Then a strong gust of wind descended howling from just above. Elise plunged from the sky like a meteor, launching a surprise attack. She had used a technique to conceal her presence. What a shame that her opponent was me. Magic took shape in his hands in an instant, and 12 burning fireballs shot out in unison. Whistling through the air, Elise's eyes widened. Her mind flooded with surprise at that casting speed, and that he could control 12 at once. She finally understood that this man was terrifyingly strong. A chain of explosions sent a roaring pillar of fire into the sky, the force of which left the crowd breathless. The spectators murmured amongst themselves that the difference between them was painfully obvious. When the smoke finally cleared, Elise was on her knees, but the fighting spirit in her eyes had not died down. On the contrary, it burned even brighter. A slight hint of surprise also reflected in Abel's mind. The referee announced that her defensive spell had been broken, and the combat was over. But Elise gritted her teeth and protested. She wasn't done yet. She demanded that the duel continue. Abel couldn't help but smile, sincerely admiring that stubborn refusal to give up. Elise planted her sword into the ground and straightened up, addressing all the spectators. She was going to prove to every single person present that she was stronger than all of them. Abel let his smile fade and voiced the question that had been brewing in his mind. In an era of peace like this, why was she still so obsessed with becoming stronger? This was nothing like the war-torn past. Nowadays, even those without powers should be able to find happiness. Elise retorted with conviction, peace is merely an illusion. Even with a peace treaty in effect, there was no guarantee it would be permanent. No one could promise that another demon king wouldn't arise, and the neighboring nations had never ceased strengthening their armies. She refused to be lulled by the comfortable illusion of a peace that could shatter at any moment. That's why she had to become strong, strong enough to protect everything. And then she was going to restore the family that had raised her. That sentence gave Abel a sense of something significant. But before he could ponder it further, Elise unleashed the last of her magic. Blazing flames enveloped her completely. Everyone present was rendered speechless. She uttered the name of a forbidden spell. The flames rose and transformed into a pair of enormous wings. With a sharp cry, she launched herself into the sky, propelled by fire. The crowd cried out in disbelief at the awe-inspiring sight before them. Alyssa spread her wings high in the air like a goddess of flames. From the stands, a gasp of wonder was heard. Flight magic was real. Abel understood that this required precise, simultaneous control over multiple attributes. Even 200 years ago, only a few had managed to master this technique. It was not a skill that could be acquired in a short time. A familiar figure flashed through his mind, a long-time old companion. He hadn't expected ancient magic to be passed down so intact. What his family must have sacrificed and dedicated to this was beyond any imagination. She announced that the demonstration was over and that it was now his turn. A beam of violet light shot out at blinding speed, directed straight at Elise in the sky. She braced herself and endured it, but she felt the very foundations of her spell rapidly crumble. The next second, a blazing gust of light erupted just behind her. Those magnificent fiery wings dissolved into scattered sparks in an instant. She screamed, and her body began to plummet. Abel leaped upward and caught her in midair. Holding her in his arms, he quietly asked her the answer he already knew. If she was a descendant of Maria, the hero of flames, he lowered her to the ground safely. His tone betrayed a hint of genuine appreciation. He told her she had true talent and encouraged her to continue growing stronger. The referee's voice resonated, declaring Abel the winner, and the entire arena erupted in cheers. The crowd surged towards the victors, treating him like a new hero, while Elise stood alone in the distance. Watching the commotion from afar, an intense mix of shame and rage washed over her at the same time. She raised a hand to cover her flushed face, unable to comprehend how she could have lost so spectacularly. After the exam, the professors couldn't stop talking enthusiastically about this year's standout talents. They showered praise upon the three of them, Elise and Abel. Only Anason, the professor in charge of grading the written exams, let out a dismissive laugh. She stated plainly that there was only one true genius, Abel, and only Abel. The other professors were perplexed. After all, he was merely a commoner with amber eyes. As for ability, Elise didn't seem any less impressive. Anason shook her head in exasperation and tiredness and held up the answer sheet with the perfect score. Abel had solved the ultimate theorem, a complex theory that even the most experienced researchers had been unable to decipher. All the professors in the room fell silent. At that moment, the venerable principal entered the room. He asked what had the professor so animated. Emerson relayed the news to him with an excitement she could barely contain. She had discovered an unparalleled genius, a student named Abel. The instant that name reached the principal's ears, his eyes widened. He was so overwhelmed with surprise that his dentures fell out of his mouth. He urgently demanded Amazon to repeat the name. When he heard Abel, For the second time, everything clicked into place within him. Deep into the night, the principal's office was filled with astonished whispers and silence. Abel's name made sleep impossible. He approached an ancient statue and gathered magic in his hands. The magic flowed into the sword held by the statue, and the room began to tremble slightly. A hidden door leading to a secret chamber slowly revealed itself. He entered a room filled with ancient texts. He walked directly to a drawer and opened it. Inside lay a letter of considerable antiquity, resting in silent stillness. Under the influence of magic, the paper unfolded. It was a final note from his grandfather, a truth written for the eyes of his descendants. The letter revealed a secret that had been completely erased from history. The story the world celebrated about the 4 sages who killed the Demon King was a lie. The 4 of them alone wouldn't have been able to touch a single hair on the Demon King's head. The one who truly defeated the Demon King was a mage with amber eyes. His name was Abel. The principal recalled his grandfather's repeated warnings that this 5th sage, simply for having amber eyes that resembled those of the demon race, had been persecuted. Despite possessing power capable of shaking the heavens, his name had been erased from the history books. But how could a human have survived for 200 years? He decided that he had to examine the true strength of that young man much more closely. In a cafe in the capital, following the entrance exams, Abel sat alone sipping coffee. Char burst through the door, great excitement reflected on his face. He waved his admission letter in the air and asked his master to guess the outcome. Abel barely glanced at it and immediately realized he had already reached his peak. Discovering his little trick, Ted felt deeply dissatisfied, but Abel suddenly shifted his gaze to a seat in the distance. He directly asked who was hiding there. A red-haired figure hadn't done a good job of hiding. Being caught red-handed, she had no choice but to offer a clumsy wave. She claimed it was a chance encounter. It was simply her favorite spot for eating cakes. Ted, naive, believed her without a second thought. Abel skipped the pleasantries and asked why she was really there. Elise immediately grew nervous. Her eyes darted back and forth. She stammered and asked him what class she had been assigned to. She admitted that, as much as it pained her to admit it, it seemed she had much to learn from him. Abel thought about what she was looking for, but Chad, at his side, couldn't contain himself and blurted out the answer with great satisfaction. He cheerfully announced that both he and his master had been assigned to Class A, the top-tier one. Upon hearing it was Class A, Elise's eyes lit up. She immediately began humming a cheerful tune and left with great animation. Abel looked at Chad, genuinely puzzled as to why she had come. Just then, the cafe door opened softly once more. The moment they saw who it was, both Chad and Abel froze. The one crossing the doorway was Lilith, and she was wearing the academy's teacher uniform. They asked her what she was doing in that attire. Lilith announced with a smile that, as of today, she had officially become a teacher at the academy. Char was so stunned he could barely blink, unable to believe such a coincidence was possible. But Abel wasn't surprised at all, knowing her abilities far surpassed the norm. Whatever Lilith set her mind to, she achieved with effortless ease. Lilith leaned down and whispered in his ear, promising that she would continue to help him in her new capacity. Before long, the day before the entrance ceremony arrived, and she herself escorted the 2 of them to the student dormitories. For the next 5 years, they would all live together in those dorms. She then excused herself to attend to some matters. After Abel thanked her, he and Ted, burdened with an absurd amount of luggage, headed inside. In the common room, they met Professor Phidia, who served as the dormitory supervisor. Abel recognized her as one of the examiners from the entrance test. Phidia also recognized them and handed them the official academy uniforms. She reminded them that they were obligated to wear them whenever they left the premises. Abel took the bag and immediately noticed something unusual about the uniform. He pointed out that a type of magic inscription had been applied to it. Phidia explained that they were inscriptions to protect against magic and stains. Abel asked who had applied them, but the answer he received was vague and evasive. After collecting their keys, the 2 were assigned adjacent rooms, but Abel couldn't stop thinking about that crude inscription on the uniform. Chad noticed something was amiss and asked what was wrong. Abel explained that the inscription work on the uniform was very poorly done, a waste of good material. He decided then and there to reapply the inscriptions himself, and started by touching up Ted's uniform first. The moment Chad put it on, he felt light as a feather. Abel was also satisfied with the result. Just as he was about to get to work on his own uniform, Chad picked up all his luggage. Chad announced that he was going to carry out bun diplomacy with his new uniform. Ted took out a specialty from his hometown, the snowball buns. Enthusiastically, He offered one to Abel to try. Abel thought the taste was quite ordinary and couldn't help but wonder if it was really a local specialty. Of course, Chad didn't think much of it and left with all the enthusiasm in the world to share them with his neighbors. He had set a goal to make 100 friends at the academy, and with that, he bolted out the door. Abel thought that, with Chad's personality, maybe that could really happen. All he wanted was to spend every day peacefully and graduate without any problems. After finishing touching up the uniform, a wave of exhaustion washed over him. He decided to take a nap in the afternoon, but just then, shouts were heard from outside. He opened the door and found Chad surrounded by a group of students. Chad's face was the very picture of confusion and innocence. Abel suspected that the Bun diplomacy had run into some kind of trouble. One of them was yelling at Chad, demanding to know if he was mocking them. Ted hurried to explain that he just wanted to make friends and that it wasn't his intention to offend. But another hurled an even more unpleasant insult, calling him an invasive species, and mocked that they wouldn't be friends with something that came out of a sewer. Abel had heard enough. He knew they were referring to a type of fish that destroys its ecosystem. Chad maintained his smile and offered the bun representing his hometown, but the other person simply swatted it away. The bun fell to the ground and rolled into the dirt. Chad's expression darkened in an instant, and anger took over him. Abel, these people had no right to trample on someone's goodwill like this. He was about to step forward, but he saw Ted silently crouch down to pick it up. Then another person stepped forward. Elise stepped forward and picked up the bun, under the astonished gaze of everyone present. She calmly took a bite and gave it a score of 70. The group immediately burst into laughter, mocking her for lacking class by picking up food from the ground. Those words completely ignited Elise's fury. Abel thought, this doesn't look good. Ted might let it go, but Elise certainly wouldn't. She stepped forward decisively and demanded that the whole pathetic scene stop at that very moment. Ted called out to her with joyful surprise, adding that he didn't actually mind, but Elise furiously turned to Dan, asking if he had any dignity. Abel suddenly understood that, even among nobles, discrimination ran so deep. When the group saw Abel intervene, their mockery became even more cruel. They taunted that someone with inferior eyes, who couldn't use magic, had no right to call himself anyone's master. Those words hit Jan right in the soft spot. He refused to let anyone speak ill of his master. He grabbed the person by the neck and demanded an immediate apology, but the other pushed him away with disgust, telling him to let go, and suddenly a memory flashed through Jan's mind. 2 years ago, he himself had mocked Abel's bird-like eyes in the exact same way. He finally understood how much pain he had caused the person he had hurt back then. Guilt and anger intertwined. He wanted to apologize, but it was not the time. The person he had grabbed began to struggle. Another person grabbed Yad by the shoulder. Then something incredible happened. Wherever Yad was touched, there was a sudden burst of light. A powerful force detonated, sending them both flying forcefully into the air. They fell to the ground in a heap, completely bewildered by what had just happened. Only Abel knew the truth. The inscription he had engraved had activated. The reflective inscription would counter any act of violence. The timing was perfect. Abel exhaled silently, relieved. The group scrambled to their feet, issued a parting threat, and fled the scene. Ted stood there frozen, but the next second he excitedly ran over, convinced that he must have some hidden power. Abel was speechless. This boy's reasoning ability was truly worrying. Pharaoh Ulsa grabbed Adder roughly by the arm and pulled him closer to examine his uniform up close. She looked at it and exclaimed in amazement that it was the most perfect inscription she had ever seen. Chad said without hesitation that it was all the work of his master. Abel's heart skipped a beat, and he hurried to cover Adder's mouth with his hand. But it was too late. Elise had heard every word clearly. Abel grabbed Chad and quickly walked away. Elise stood there still stunned. Abel was capable of performing magic of that level of difficulty. Who exactly was he? The next day, the welcome ceremony was about to begin. The two of them sprinted down the hallway at full speed. Chad apologized for having spoken too much. By the time they reached the hall doors, Ted was already panting, but Abel noticed something unusual about the doors. He examined them closely and realized it wasn't a trap. It was a welcome ceremony. To go unnoticed, he elbowed Chad to go in first. Chad was too afraid that there would be some punishment for latecomers, and refused to move. Abel simply gave him a firm push to get him through the doors. In an instant, the sound of mechanical gears and cheerful music filled the air in unison. Chad stood there gaping at the dazzling spectacle before him. Confetti rained down, and small wooden puppets of intricate craftsmanship danced to the music. Abel explained that it was all just magic, a mechanism designed to detect the magical energy of whoever opened the door, and to set itself in motion. Looking up, they saw wooden puppets several stories high, all playing together to welcome them. The other new students turned and fixed their gazes on Ted. They all assumed it was he who had triggered the grand ceremony. Even the night march, which was rarely heard, had apparently been played in his honor. The group who had mocked them yesterday paled with barely contained rage. Even the professors were convinced that Ted was the strongest new student of the year. Ted smiled like an idiot again, completely forgetting his fear and previous reluctance. Just then the principal appeared, calling the hall to order. He too was pleasantly surprised that the night march had been heard this year. Abel remained silent among the crowd, evaluating the new students surrounding him. About 200 students per year, a larger number than he had imagined. Chad leaned towards him enthusiastically and filled him in on the principal's background. That old man was a direct descendant of Roa, the wind hero. The name Roa brought back 200 years of memories. They had fought side by side, as close as brothers, and together they had defeated the Demon King. But what came after was something Abel did not wish to relive. The principal's speech dragged on endlessly. Chad kept flipping through the orientation booklet, trying to share more interesting tidbits. Abel's mood had become complicated, and he only responded with cold replies and brief ones. The ceremony finally ended, and they followed the crowd in search of their classroom. Chad noticed that he seemed dejected and asked with genuine concern. Abel shook his head, saying he was fine, but the words had barely left his mouth when his whole body tensed up. Chad was even more confused, not knowing what his master had sensed this time. Abel scanned the area suspiciously, feeling a deep unease wash over him. A strange gaze had settled upon him. It was not the gaze of a living being. It felt more like the prying eye of a magic tool. Had someone already found out his hidden true identity and was investigating him? Back in the classroom, everyone was already talking about him. A green-haired student downplayed the humiliation of the previous day, insisting that they had simply been repelled by the defensive inscription on the uniform. Elise overheard all of it. Her expression grew increasingly irritated. The door opened, and Chad and Abel entered together. Almost all eyes in the room turned to them in an instant. Ted noticed the strange atmosphere and shifted uneasily, uncomfortable. Abel, however, had long since grown accustomed to that level of scrutiny and the hushed whispers. A few familiar faces from the previous day were already casting hostile glances their way. Just then, a man in slippers entered. He carelessly dropped his books on the lectern and ran a hand through his disheveled hair. But that was enough to send a wave of barely contained excitement through the room. Chad instantly lit up upon recognizing who had just entered. It was the most powerful mage of the current era. Abel recalled reading articles about this man. His skills truly deserved recognition. Ted added that the difficult question on the written entrance exam had been his. Abel understood then, but the man's unkempt appearance was somewhat unexpected. Professor Amazin skipped the roll call and went straight to the lesson. One student brazenly raised his hand and asked if he was too busy with research to bother teaching. Amazin remained unfazed and openly admitted it. He was only there to secure research funding. The student persisted, asking why he had made an exception to take on this class as a tutor. Amazon's expression shifted, and he swept his serious gaze across the entire class. He said it was because there was something in this class that he needed to verify for himself. The moment he uttered those words, his eyes landed directly and precisely on Abel. All of Abel's alarms went off at once. There was no doubt that that gaze, the same gaze that had been watching him through a magic artifact, came from this man, and so Abel's school life began under the shadow of that unsettling feeling. His days settled into a rhythm: classes, the library, back to the dormitory, the occasional quiet conversation with Lilith, a routine to the point of monotony. The hardest part to endure was the long class hours that numbed the mind. Ted kept squirming in his seat, complaining about how difficult the classes were. But for Abel, the material was so superficial that it was almost physically painful to endure. He had no choice but to use his own paper and pen in class to work on his own magic. One day, the professor finally cast an impatient glance his way. He called Abel to the front to solve a problem. The intention couldn't have been clearer. Nothing more than an excuse to make an example of this inferiorized student and reassert his authority. Abel calmly stood up, not taking this professor into account at all. The man who taught directly from the book and made students copy notes word for word. Abel decided to show his own summarized approach instead. He stated from the outset that his answer might differ from what was in the textbook. He then explained his method, demonstrating how to reduce the complicated process into 10 steps. The professor, standing on stage, was completely frozen. The students below erupted in a mixture of awe and disbelief. The professor, his dignity in tatters, swallowed his fury and told Abel to sit back down. As Abel turned to leave, a sarcastic remark cut through the air. The same trio from yesterday, every word dripping with passive-aggressive mockery. Abel acted as if he hadn't heard anything and walked directly to his seat. He had no interest in wasting energy on this. Within the academy, there were a total of 5 libraries, large and small. The large one had an enormous collection, but too many people. He normally checked out books there, and then went to read in one of the smaller ones, and quieter ones. One day, while engrossed in reading, a familiar voice broke the silence. It was Elise. He was slightly surprised. He hadn't expected her to come to the library to study. She asked him if he had finished the day's homework. He honestly admitted that he could finish it before bed. After that, the two fell silent, and each returned to immersing themselves in their own books. Elise got stuck on a difficult problem, and sat for a long time without writing a single word. She was still debating whether or not to ask. When Abel's voice cut in, without looking up from his book, he pointed out exactly where her reasoning had gone astray. Elise blinked in surprise, astonished that he had been paying attention while she read. She followed his suggestion and tried again, and soon had the answer. Abel thought to himself that her capacity for comprehension was far ahead of most people's. As they left late that night, Elise thanked him for his help. She curiously asked if he spent every day like this in the library. When he confirmed that he did, she couldn't help but suggest he go out and see the world a bit. Life in the city was full of excitement and new experiences, like the restaurant everyone raved about, or the uncommon exotic fruit desserts. Abel immediately pointed out that all the examples she had given had to do with food. He quickly added that there were also used bookstores to browse through. That immediately piqued Abel's interest. Alyssa seized the moment and cautiously extended an invitation, intending to thank him for his help. Abel thought he had no particular reason to refuse and agreed. Just then, a shrill, sarcastic voice cut in from behind them. The same trio, brimming with passive-aggressive taunts, mocked him for being popular with girls. Abel calmly asked what they wanted. The blue-haired one snapped at him that he was arrogant and told him to stop pretending. The green-haired one went further and pulled out a magic tool, threatening to teach him a lesson. Confident that they felt close to protecting him, they could finally make him suffer. But Abel asked them a question first. He wanted to know why they despised external students so much. The green-haired one's face contorted with instant rage, letting out the resentment he had suppressed. They had spent years working and studying just to earn their place here, but outsiders could join them just by passing an exam. That infuriated him beyond reason. Abel laughed coldly inwardly, seeing no proof of all that supposed effort. He indifferently placed his backpack on the table, and the next second the magic tool was in his hand. They hadn't even seen him move, not even Elise gasped. Abel idly spun the weapon in his hands with a slight frown. He pointed out that the magic tool was in poor condition. The magic runes engraved on it had deteriorated due to neglect. He then returned it indifferently, implying that the owner should take better care of his belongings. The green-haired student tried to catch it clumsily and fell face first onto the ground. Abel turned his gaze away from them and told Elise they were leaving. The green-haired student got up, trembling with rage. He swore viciously that he would make them both regret it the next day. The next day's physical education class had Chad bursting with excitement. Abel and Elise watched him with a mixture of resignation and understanding. After all, it was a class they only had once a week, so his enthusiasm was understandable. The physical education teacher, Cantor, announced that today's activity was magic ball combat. Everyone cheered. Chad curiously asked about the rules, and Elise didn't know them either. The professor was about to explain them when the green-haired student interrupted him with an air of smugness. He announced that they already knew all the rules by heart. Professor Cantor smiled, and his words betrayed an unmistakable bias. He said that the class always had to adapt to ignorant students. The green-haired student cast a meaningful glance towards Abel's group. Elise instantly became enraged, determined to teach them a lesson, but Chad cheerfully told her to relax, that the most important thing was to have fun. Cantor began dividing them into teams, calling out names and having them gather accordingly. Once the commotion subsided, Abel's teammates gathered around him. Chad was still beaming about being on the same team as his master. Elise couldn't help but snap at him that he was as clumsy as a shoe. Abel pointed out that all the members of the team were external students. The distribution was too deliberate to be a coincidence. Char finally realized that something was wrong. Two of his teammates admitted that they had no athletic ability. The other two said that they were mediocre at best and lacked self-confidence. Elise stepped forward and promised that she would carry the team's weight. They decided that they were going to win cleanly and shut the other team up once and for all. Those words reignited the fighting spirit in their teammates. Only Abel remained wary. The opposing team was not playing fair. Indeed, the green-haired student hurled another taunt as he passed, and Professor Cantor's face bore a mocking smile that didn't fit a neutral party. Abel understood immediately. Even the professor was on their side. The match began quickly with Team B attacking and Team D defending. The rules were simple. The attacking team would fire 3 types of magic bullets using magic tools. The defending team had to dodge them and survive, and the team that kept the most members standing would be declared the winner. The battle commenced. The members of Team D began to move and dodge. Ted suddenly realized that it was like Doc Hebel. He had barely finished saying it when he backflipped to dodge an attack. He instinctively sensed the incoming attacks before they arrived. Abel thought his athletic reflexes were truly impressive. But the next second, the bespectacled boy took a hit and fell unconscious. The magic bullets had been weakened, but the impact still hurt. Chad barely managed to block an attack. Elise narrowly dodged another. Then 2 magic bullets flew directly at Abel from the front. Abel thought it was strange how direct and simple the attack seemed. As the bullets abruptly turned at a right angle at the last moment, he turned his head quickly and saw that 2 other teammates had already fallen to the ground. A single ambush had cost his team 2 members in an instant. Abel's heart sank completely. His alertness reached its peak. The faces of the attacking trio wore triumphant smiles. Elise cried out that the attack was a clear violation of the rules. They had manipulated their attribute-less magic. The shooting gloves had been secretly equipped with runes designed to track targets. It was a blatant cheat, but the other side made light of it, replying that their opponents were just sore losers. One of them added a rude insult, directed at Elise's body. That was enough to completely ignite Elise's fury. Abel immediately placed a hand on her shoulder and quietly told her to remain calm. He reminded her that verbal provocation was a common tactic in a fight. At this moment, they needed to stay focused and be alert for attacks that might come from any direction. Elise blushed. Her closeness made her more nervous than she expected. The combat continued amidst the chaos. Abel kept a cool head and observed everything around him. He noticed something different about the black-haired girl named Yukari. Her athletic ability was nothing special, but she kept warning her teammates of impending danger. Wide field of vision, calm under pressure, a scout who was being hugely underestimated. Abel thought that, if only she could improve her passive personality, she could become an extraordinarily capable mage. Just then, 3 magic bullets whistled towards them from a sharp angle. They slammed directly into her back. Yukari cried out in pain and fell face first to the ground. The ferocity of the blow shocked everyone who saw it. Abel frowned. The other side knew they had to neutralize the scout first, but the green-haired student burst into laughter. Mocking her to get out of the way, he fired again, aiming directly at Yukari as she struggled to get up. Another direct hit to the back. Yukari winced in pain. Elise turned indignantly, demanding to know what they thought they were doing. But the green-haired student shrugged, shouting that he was simply expelling the invasive species from before. He hadn't even finished uttering the words when an even denser barrage of magic bullets rained down on Yukari, and dozens of impacts slammed into her fragile back. Tears and sweat from pain ran down her face together. Ted ran to protect her, and Elise stepped in to argue with them. But the green-haired student mocked Elise for thinking herself too important. The moment Elise was distracted by the argument, she received an attack from behind. It caught her completely off guard. A magic bullet hit her, and she fell to the ground, staggering. Abel sighed inwardly. The IC. He let his emotions get the better of him too easily. Chad couldn't take it anymore and raised his hand, protesting to the professor on the sidelines. He demanded that the professor make a decision about the unfair attack that had just occurred. But before he could even finish, the same ambush caught him too. Several magic bullets hit him in the back and left him lying on the ground. Abel helplessly rubbed his forehead. The one who tried to help was the first to fall. The green-haired student gloated with satisfaction, declaring that, after all, external students were useless. Invasive species should crawl back to the sewer they came from. Elise and Yad lay there furious, no longer able to get up and fight. Yukari sobbed silently, her body trembling with pain and fear. Ivo looked around the field. His heart was ice cold, Less than 2 minutes after the match began, the defending team had been practically wiped out. The only one still standing on the field was him. The three from the attacking team advanced, eager to finish the job. The green-haired student took the lead, looking at him like a predator eyes its prey. He called to his teammates to concentrate their fire. 3 magic bullets were fired simultaneously towards Evo. The thought of surrendering briefly crossed Abel's mind. It would undoubtedly be easier, but the cruelty of the other side stirred something within him, a cold, growing irritation. He made a decision and ducked, nimbly dodging the first volley. The attacks continued to come. The green-haired student seemed lost in them, but Abel moved through the dense bombardment like smoke. Lightly and effortlessly, his teammates from the sidelines cheered him on with frantic urgency. The green-haired student saw this and let out a dismissive laugh. He asked Abel if he was already running out of breath. Abel didn't feel a single tremor within him. If anything, he thought it was the other one who was getting tired. Just then, the professor announced that only 1 minute remained for the assault. The green-haired student's eyes hardened, and he began to gather a massive amount of magic. He decided to give it his all. Suddenly, a colossal sphere of light materialized. Dozens of smaller magic bullets broke off from it and shot out in all directions. Elise and Jack from the sidelines watched with their hearts in their mouths. Abel detected it immediately. The other side had illegally added a dispersal rune. The green-haired student gloated triumphantly, daring him to dodge this one. Abel thought to himself that dodging it directly wouldn't be that difficult, but he still preferred to keep a low profile. Silently, he set his magic in motion beneath the surface. Then he ducked and covered his head, pretending to try to protect himself. The magic bullets rained down on him, but each and every one of them strangely veered off course before they could touch him. The entire audience was stunned, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The green-haired student's face went blank. He suspected that his magic tool had malfunctioned. The final whistle blew at that very moment, and Abel stood, completely unharmed. Ted pounced on him excitedly, declaring that his master was incredible. Abel stopped him, reminding him that it was too soon to celebrate. In the next round, offense and defense would switch, and they would have to take out all and every one of the opponents. It was now Abel's, Ted's, and Elise's turn to go on the offensive. Chad was enthusiastic and swore that they would win this round. Elise was eager to show what they were truly capable of. Abel, for his part, was counting on his teammates to draw all the attention. The opposing side showed no hint of concern. They even threw out more taunts. Abel realized they had something up their sleeve. The signal was given to begin the next round. The green-haired student ordered his team to form a defensive formation. His teammates quickly positioned themselves back-to-back, forming a tight defensive circle. Ted launched the first attack, with Magic Bullet charging forward at full speed. Elise followed closely with her own offense. Someone from the formation immediately yelled, Northwest Spear-type attack, and another followed up with a Southeast Disc-type Magic Bullet. Abel instantly understood their strategy. They had divided coverage amongst themselves, sharing information to eliminate any blind spots. It was a truly well-coordinated defensive formation. Chad looked nervous and turned to yell for help. Elise felt just as stuck, unsure of how to break through. Abel had to admit it. The other team's coordination was excellent, but they had still overlooked one thing. Abel called Chad over to his side. He told him that the finishing blow in this match belonged to him. The two began to speak in hushed tones, devising their final battle plan. A moment later, they looked up in unison, their gazes fixed on their opponents. Ted, having heard the plan, raised his arm above his head and began to recite an exaggerated and prolonged incantation, and the entire opposing team froze, bewildered by whatever ritual he was performing. Even Abel thought it was a bit over the top. Then, silently, he set his own magic in motion. Power flowed into Chan's fingertips. Responding to the rhythm of his chanting, Ted spoke the final line to unleash the power, and Abel inwardly recited the true incantation for storm magic. But nothing seemed to happen. Confusion began to spread through the air, until someone pointed at the sky in alarm, and everyone looked up. A massive ring of magical energy had already taken shape overhead. Countless magic bullets rained down from within it like a storm. The opposing team had no time to react. They were buried under the bombardment. Instantly, they fell one after another. The field was left in ruins. The green-haired student struggled and tried to get up, only to be knocked down again by a precise shot. The physical education teacher looked at the students sprawled on the ground, too stunned to speak. In the end, he had no choice but to grit his teeth and proclaim Abel's team the winner. Everyone erupted in enthusiastic cheers, celebrating the comeback. Elise turned to the excited Ted and asked why he had been hiding his strength before. Ted could only stammer awkwardly, insisting that it had all been a coincidence. Realizing that all the attention had shifted to him, Abel let out a silent sigh of relief. Just then the green-haired student staggered to his feet, his face etched with bitterness and humiliation. Abel looked at him coldly and told him that he didn't know how hard the internal students had worked. But what he could say with certainty was that Ted had earned his place there, solely through his own ability, built upon countless days and nights of study and training. The green-haired student listened until the end, and then slumped to the ground without another word. Then a friendly hand extended before him. Ted crouched down and invited him again to go eat buns together someday. Abel shook his head. He hadn't given up on selling his buns yet. The green-haired student sat there with his head bowed, clearly lost in thought. Finally, he simply let out a dismissive chuckle and turned to help his teammate up. Elise was not amused at all, thinking he had a lot of nerve being so ungrateful. But Chad took it lightly, optimistically saying that it was still progress. After all this time, the boy hadn't swatted his hand away. He reaffirmed his goal of making 100 friends with renewed conviction. Abel watched the whole scene as a faint smile silently formed on his lips. As evening fell, Principal Mikkel walked alone down a dimly lit corridor. He headed towards a hidden door and silently opened it with magic. Behind it lay Professor Amazonator's cramped, underground workshop. Amazon stared intently at a screen. On it, images from that afternoon's match played on a loop. Amazon told the principal that the images had been captured by a reconnaissance drone of his own design. The images showed the moment Chad cast his spell. The instant the magic bullets began to rain down from above, Miai watched intently. His expression gradually shifted to one of surprise. Emerson excitedly pointed out that it was an exceptionally brilliant camouflage magic trick. Abel had been silently articulating something at that moment. Amazon's eyes gleamed with obsession. He was going to find out exactly who Abel was. The day of the field trip arrived in no time, and Abel recalled Elise's invitation. As he descended from the dormitory, the person on duty stopped him for a moment. Lilith stood there, a soft smile on her face. She assumed he was heading to the library as usual, but Abel handed her the completed permission slip. Lilith's smile froze instantly on her face. She asked him quietly if he was going out with his classmate Elise, because she had just received another permission slip with almost identical details. Abel didn't understand. Was there something wrong with that? Lilith bit her lip and suppressed her bitterness. In the end, she simply shook her head and told him to have fun. Abel turned to leave without noticing at all the disappointment reflected on her face. Just as he was about to push the door open, someone grabbed his sleeve. Lilith, sighing, lowered her voice, her tone barely above a whisper, and asked if he might perhaps find a moment to take her for a stroll sometime too. Abel was slightly surprised, but agreed. Lilith immediately brightened and flashed a radiant, brilliant smile. That smile stirred something in Abel. It reminded him of how she was as a child. Despite having lived for 200 years, she still showed that childish expression from time to time. And just then, he suddenly recalled the sincere confession she had made 2 years ago. He supposed it was probably just the affection a child felt for someone older. In the plaza, Elise had been waiting for a while. Abel apologized for being late, which seemed to catch her off guard. She laughed and teased him, saying she didn't expect him to know how to apologize. Then she declared with full confidence that she was going to take him around every corner of the royal capital today. Their first stop was an imposing commemorative clock tower. Abel was completely captivated by the intricate interlocking gears. Elise, for her part, peered out the window and excitedly called him over to see the view. Under the clear sky, the line of sight extended to the distant sea horizon. Abel's gaze fixed on a black speck moving on the water. The stern of the ship left a long trail of dark smoke behind it. Elise explained that it was a steamship. He didn't even know what that was. Abel recalled what he had read in books, and a surge of genuine curiosity washed over him. Elise watched him as he stared intently at the horizon, and something quietly took root deep within her heart. After that, they listened to a new style of music, watched a romantic movie. Abel silently absorbed that kind of vitality that no book could capture. As they walked down a lively street, a store with a dazzling sign caught his eye. Elise explained that it was what they called an arcade, a place of entertainment. Normally, a place where idle people went to waste their money and time. To her surprise, Abel immediately became interested. His eyes lit up as he said he wanted to go in and take a look. Elise found herself taken aback, but she agreed to accompany him anyway, unbeknownst to them. Amazon's surveillance drone tracked their every move. The two entered and were immediately enveloped by a surge of noise and crowds. And the strange, colorful attractions made Abel feel both strange and fascinated. Then suddenly, an unpleasant voice was heard from behind them, followed by a skeletal hand landing on Elise's shoulder. The skeleton lunged forward, and Elise let out a startled cry out of pure instinct. She turned and grabbed Abel, hugging him tightly. Abel assured her that it was just a magic accessory. Elise came to her senses, embarrassed, and quickly pulled away from him. The skeleton cheerfully indicated where the attraction area was. The moment the two entered, Elise's eyes immediately lit up. Right there were her favorite series of claw machines with monsters. She excitedly explained that the plush toys were made to resemble magical beasts. Abel looked at the figures and found them strangely familiar. Many of them looked exactly like the monsters he himself had fought at some point. Elise pointed to her favorite Gemmies, which wasn't exactly what you'd call an adorable magical beast, but it looked incredibly powerful and must be a formidable fighter. Avella subconsciously felt Genie's was undoubtedly powerful. It could turn anything to stone. In his day, it had taken wind magic and great effort to defeat it. Elise gave him an interrogative look, and her chest tightened. She realized at that moment that she had let something slip. She hurried to find a way to justify it, but then Elise suddenly burst into laughter and said, "What a strange joke." He played along and let that serve as a cover, but Elise unexpectedly became self-conscious and asked him if she seemed strange to him. All the other girls liked cute things. She was the only one who liked daring things. Abel shook his head and honestly told her that it suited her perfectly. He believed that internal qualities mattered more than external appearances. That made Elise stop dead in her tracks, and a quiet warmth spread through her chest. She said joyfully that she liked Gemmies even more now. Abel asked her if she wanted the plush toy. Elise became a little uneasy, admitting that she did, but complaining about how small the claw was. Abel silently set his magic in motion, analyzing the machine's mechanics, and discovered that the gripping force had been adjusted to the absolute minimum, and that the controls had been deliberately slowed down. He laughed coldly inwardly. Such a twisted trap was just what he needed. He inserted a coin, ready to turn the impossible into the inevitable. Magic silently settled onto the mechanical claw, strengthening its grip. The claw descended firmly and closed tightly around the plush toy. Elise held her breath as she watched the figure steadily rise into the air, and then fall cleanly into the slot. Abel's second encounter with the Gemmies ended in victory once more. He pulled out the plush toy and handed it to Elise. Elise's cheeks visibly flushed. She took the plush toy and instinctively held it up to hide her blushing face. She promised that she would take very good care of it. Abel didn't miss that flustered expression at all. Afterwards, they went into a cafe specializing in desserts. Elise closed her eyes in satisfaction and loudly praised the waffles. It was Abel's first time trying one. Elise's gaze fell on his serving, and she asked if she could have a bite. Abel agreed, cut off a piece, and offered it to her. But Elise simply ate it straight from the fork without a second thought. She made a thorough assessment of the waffles' taste. Abel began to eat his own serving. The taste was indeed quite good. He then commented that he was a little surprised. He had expected her to mind the indirect contact. Elise froze and her face flushed at an alarming rate. Abel realized only then that she hadn't even noticed at that moment, and he apologized for saying something unnecessary. Elise composed herself as best she could, and stiffly insisted that it was nothing worth making a fuss over. Seeing her embarrassment, Abel dropped the subject, turned to look out the window, and noticed something peculiar about the street scene. Elise agreed that the place's vintage aesthetic had a special charm, but Abel quietly said that the scenery made him feel something more akin to nostalgia. That left Elise stunned. She pointed out that finding something charmingly retro and personally feeling nostalgic were two entirely different things. Abel was suddenly speechless. Realizing that she had let something slip again, Elise looked directly at him and asked him the question she had been holding onto for a long time. Who exactly was he? The question left Abel silent. He had no intention of telling anyone his reincarnation secret. All he wanted was to lead a peaceful school life. Just then, a flash in the distance not far away blinded his eyes. It was a surveillance magic artifact pointing directly at them. He decided to deal with that nuisance first and cut short the interrogation. Elise watched him, bewildered. The very next instant, Abel's face loomed over her with surprising speed, close enough for her to feel his breath. Her heart pounded, but Abel's target was the sky behind her. A silent fireball launched and destroyed the surveillance device. The explosion caused Elise to turn her head sharply and then she suddenly understood. He asked her what she was about to say. She lowered her head and quietly said to forget it, and apologized for prying into his private affairs. Her expression couldn't hide the pain, though avoiding further questions was for the best. Abel still felt uneasy. Elise bit her lower lip, as a wave of bittersweet feelings washed over her. She didn't want to see that look in his eyes again, the one that deliberately closed itself off and shut her out. And at that moment, it became undeniably clear to her that she was afraid. She had truly fallen in love with Abel. At dusk, the two returned together to the academy gates, but Abel sensed that the surveillance had not ceased. He was growing tired of it and decided to handle the situation his own way. He made up an excuse and sent Elise ahead. Elise nodded, said goodbye, and continued walking. Abel turned around and walked into a deserted alley. He stopped deep within it and clearly sensed two hidden presences. He told whoever was hiding in the shadows to come out. Now a female mage materialized from the darkness. Abel immediately noticed her gray eyes. It was a technique that used earth element magic to blend in with the surroundings. Her revealing attire was likely intended to enhance her magic's precision. Just then, another voice came from the rooftop above. A male mage dropped down, expressing his surprise that such a young boy had managed to detect them. The female mage let out that it was no wonder. Considering that he knew that person, Abel immediately realized, and pressed her to tell him who had hired them. The male mage quickly reprimanded his companion for always saying more than she should. He turned around and stated firmly that he would not reveal the client's identity under any circumstances. That was all Abel needed to feel genuinely involved. Only an opponent of that caliber was worthy of being taken seriously. At that very moment, Professor Amazon was making his solitary way through the academy halls. A familiar loneliness clung to him like a shadow. As always, no one argues with insects, and no one goes stargazing with apes. There had never been a single person in the world who could discuss magic with him as an equal. The astonishing talent he had shown since childhood, inventing magic tools on his own at an early age, had brought him not understanding, but deep and unbridgeable isolation. Others praised him to his face, calling him a genius, but behind his back there was only envy and mockery. His overwhelming ability had led to a bottomless loneliness. When he entered the academy, he tried to fit in, but soon realized that accommodating mediocrity was a pointless retreat. A diamond can only be polished by another diamond or by something harder. Without a worthy rival, even a genius cannot truly grow. There were times when he felt so suffocated that he could barely find a reason to carry on, until Abel appeared like a light piercing the darkness. Observing and testing, this young man's abilities had reignited his enthusiasm. To that end, he had not hesitated to utilize the resources of the Chronos Magical Society. Those two expert mages were his companions. To understand Abel, he was willing to use any means necessary. He pushed open his workshop door and froze instantly, his eyes wide open. Abel was sitting calmly in his chair, sipping tea. The young man turned and greeted him, apologizing for the intrusion. Amazon forced himself to contain his surprise and asked him how he had managed to bypass the layers of barriers. The defensive magic he had set up had far more than 2 or 3 layers of depth. Abel said that those barriers were like tissue paper. Ama-sen chuckled clumsily and praised him for being impressive and full of surprises. But Abel cut off the fake kindness at the root without another word. He told Amazon that his partners had already told him everything. His demand was simple: stop all surveillance immediately. Ama-sen stood there, utterly stunned, completely unprepared for the fact that he had been discovered so quickly. That Abel had forced those two to talk. What kind of power would it have taken for that? He composed himself and asked inquiringly, and what if he refused? He had barely finished uttering those words when a terrifying surge of magic enveloped him. Abel's eyes were icy, laden with the unmistakable weight of a death threat. Ama-sen froze from the overwhelming force of that presence. His body kept trembling, but beneath the fear hid a completely different feeling, something akin to fascination. He finally relented, saying that he would accept all demands. Abel slowly withdrew that suffocating energy. Mason exhaled in relief, but his curiosity got the better of him. He asked why he was still at this academy. There should be nothing worth learning here anymore. Abel said that he simply wanted a quiet, uneventful school life. Nothing more than that. Mason's eyes turned cold, and he said that was too big of a joke. He lowered his voice and spoke of what he considered a genius's destiny. With such power, changing the world at will was within his grasp. Not even ruling ordinary people was a fantasy. Abel frowned, and his revulsion was clearly reflected on his face. He walked past him unceremoniously. He said bluntly that he had no interest in any of that and left without looking back. Emma Sen slumped against the desk, his heart still pounding. He had met many brilliant people, but he had never felt a killing intent like that. A smile of excitement drew at the corner of his lips. He was sure that Abel's existence would push him to a whole new level. The night deepened. Elise went to look for Abel with the plush toy in her arms. Charlie had said he wasn't there, and she waited alone at the foot of the dormitory building. She wanted to give him the plush toy and thank him in person. As she gently stroked the plush toy, a familiar voice came from the direction of the trees. Abel's tone was impatient, asking why she had come at such a late hour. A woman's voice offered a soft apology. Elise hid to observe, and when she saw who it was, she was stunned. The person talking to Abel was Professor Lilith. Lilith quietly told him how much she had missed him. Abel reminded her that she should avoid drawing unnecessary attention. He turned to leave, telling her to save whatever she had to say for after class. What happened next almost took Elise's breath away. Lilith stood on tiptoe and gave him a gentle kiss on the forehead. Lilith's cheeks were flushed, and Abel only sighed with exasperated resignation, saying that she hadn't changed one bit since she was little. Elise slipped away into the shadows. What on earth was going on? The next day, Elise was sitting in a cafe in a bad mood. When Yukari arrived, she immediately noticed that something was wrong. Elise, who never refused dessert, had only ordered a plain coffee. Yukari leaned towards her with concern and asked if something was troubling her. Elise finally told her quietly what she had witnessed. She had seen Professor Lilith kiss Abel on the forehead. She couldn't help but wonder if the two of them were together. Yukari blinked upon hearing that and immediately understood what was troubling Elise. She quickly smiled and reassured her, telling her that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. Since Abel and Professor Lilith were actually siblings, an older sister and a younger brother. That news had already spread throughout the entire academy. Chad had also confirmed it. Elise found it hard to believe, but still found it strange. Why would real siblings have to meet in secret and express their feelings through something like a kiss? Of all things, Yukari supposed that they were probably being cautious due to the professor-student dynamic between them, and that, since they were simply very close, a kiss was just their way of showing affection. Elise thought about it and decided it made sense. The cloud hanging over her heart dissipated in an instant, and her appetite returned with a vengeance. She was going to order the largest slice of cake on the menu. Yukari saw her come back to life and couldn't help but laugh. At the same time, Abel was alone in the underground training room running. He had been running for 2 hours already. It was merely his usual daily routine. The training room was empty and silent, as was usual on a holiday. That gave him the vague feeling that modern mages seemed to have completely neglected physical conditioning. Just then, Ted burst into the room yelling. Having finally located him, Abel felt a pang of resignation. His quiet sanctuary had been discovered. Ted excitedly asked him if he had decided which research club he was going to join. Only then did Abel recall hearing something about it during enrollment. But he honestly admitted that he wasn't interested at all. Ted enthusiastically explained that research clubs were voluntary extracurricular groups. There had even been cases where clubs' findings had received national recognition. Internally, Abel was unimpressed. It was, after all, student-level work. He had learned through countless years of experience that researching magic was something that had to be done alone. In his opinion, working with another was of little use. Taro Chad refused to let it go and kept insisting that there might be something that would pique his interest. Abel found himself hesitating. It wasn't fair to dismiss something as trivial without even seeing it first. And besides, Chad's eyes reflected nothing but sincere and fervent anticipation. In the end, Abel let out a sigh and relented. Ted let out a triumphant shout. He led Abel to the place where the clubs gathered. The place was filled with noise. People kept enthusiastically stopping Chad, hoping he would join their club. Abel watched silently, noting that the clubs were divided into 2 broad types, the ones based on magic and the sporty ones. But there were so many that it was impossible to examine each one closely. Just then, a deep voice came from behind them. There stood an imposing figure in full armor. Chad was thoroughly spooked. The figure laughed and removed his helmet, explaining that it was just the competition team. Next, he complimented Chad's physique and invited him to try armored ball. The succession of technical terms left Chad completely bewildered, but Abel, beside him, understood perfectly. It seemed like a very old sport, akin to rugby. Chad turned to invite his master to come take a look with him, but the upperclassman's expression turned uncomfortable as his gaze fell on Abel. Tactfully, he suggested that it would be a bit inconvenient for a student with amber eyes to participate. Abel had long been accustomed to being treated as someone incapable of handling magic, which suited him just fine. It gave him a natural reason to leave. Just then, the club captain approached in his armor. The upperclassman leaned towards him and explained the situation in a low voice. Upon hearing this, the captain burst into laughter without the slightest attempt to conceal it. He bluntly declared that allowing someone with inferior eyesight to join the club would drag the entire club's reputation through the mud. Abel sighed, not wanting to get involved in further confrontations. Fairachel had already frowned deeply. Abel gave Taru a light nudge on the ear, indicating that it wasn't worth getting angry over. In any case, he wasn't interested in ball sports, so leaving posed no loss. What he didn't expect was that those words would accidentally trigger the captain's fury. The captain suddenly erupted in rage, announcing that the one thing he could not stand was being looked down upon. The sheer hypocrisy of it left both Abel and Tad speechless. Before anyone could respond, the captain grabbed the ball and lunged directly at Abel, yelling that he was about to show him that this was much more than just a ball game. Abel agilely ducked to the side and tripped the captain. The captain staggered on one foot. The ball flew from his arms and soared into the air. He barely managed to regain his balance, but the humiliation had consumed his last shred of sanity, and so he lunged at Abel a second time. Abel resigned himself. This wasn't going to end well. He leaped lightly into the air and caught the falling ball with ease. From the air, he casually yelled, "I'm returning the ball to you," but he had silently applied a material enhancement spell. The ball fell with impressive force and struck the captain squarely in the face. With a dull thud, the captain fell heavily to the ground. The sudden turn of events instantly drew everyone's gaze. Abel realized he had gotten carried away once again. As everyone rushed towards the captain, Abel and Tad silently slipped away into the crowd. They visited many other clubs, but still found none that convinced them. Ted, on the other hand, was welcomed everywhere, while Abel found none of them remotely interesting. He was about to give up when a burst of passionate chanting reached his ears. A group of people clad in black robes had gathered in a corner, loudly clamoring for a world at peace. Abel looked closer. What they sought to eliminate from the world was magic itself. This struck him as perplexing. If they were against magic, why had they come to this academy? Their leader raised his fist and declared that the era of revolution had arrived. Abel looked again and froze. The one leading the group was none other than Boss, whom he hadn't seen in a long time. He knew Boss was at the academy, but he never expected to encounter him in this manner. Boss didn't look well, but his eyes were terribly piercing. A surge of unease washed over Abel. He called out to the green-haired student to ask what was going on. The other student looked at him in surprise, as if he had asked something everyone already knew. He explained that it was a radical anti-magic organization. They preached peace in appearance, but had caused no small amount of trouble for society. Seeing that Abel was unaware of anything, the student's tone reverted to its usual condescension. He scoffed, saying it was to be expected. No research club would want to accept someone with inferior eyesight. Abel had no interest in arguing. He turned to leave, but the student called out to him, saying he had the perfect place, the ideal club for someone like him. They stopped in front of a quiet, deserted table. A blue-eyed girl sat alone under an awning, reading silently. Everyone who passed by avoided her, as if she were a forbidden zone. The green-haired student called her the Ice Queen Noelle. She possessed overwhelming ability, but never spoke to anyone. He said that, in that regard, she and Abel were quite similar. Both were unsociable outsiders, and perhaps they would get along. With that, he turned and walked away. Abel watched her intently. Those blue eyes were undoubtedly the hallmark of water element magic. Her magic was notably stronger than that of an average student. The sign on the stall read, Ancient Magic Research Club. It gave off an air of mystery. Abel lightly tapped the table in front of him. Noelle finally looked up and met his gaze with cold indifference. Abel bluntly stated that he was interested in ancient magic and wanted to know more. Noelle said nothing more. She simply closed the thick book she held in her hands. Then she placed a square wooden box on the table and told him to open it first. Abel recognized the object immediately. It was a labyrinth circuit, a mysterious device used to test skill through deciphering complex runes. And this particular one, so finely crafted, had clearly been created by herself. Without another word, she ran her fingers over the box's surface and began to analyze the runes. Her magic flowed with precision, guided by her will. Along the single correct path, with a soft click, the lid sprang open. Noelle's eyes widened instantly, disbelief etched on her face. Abel calmly placed the box back on the table and said it was open. She picked it up and examined it repeatedly, suspecting it had broken. After all, most people needed at least an hour to solve it. Abel offered no explanation and simply reminded her that she had made a promise. Noelle looked at him with a complicated expression and finally relented. She followed his silent lead as they walked inside. A sign on the wall read, "No students beyond this point." It stood out strikingly. He asked her where they were headed. Noelle gestured forward, but all that lay ahead was a cold stone wall. She reached for her neck and removed a small pendant. It looked like a seal. She pressed it against a discreet gold relief carved into the wall, and then a hidden door silently took shape in the stone. Abel followed her through, and before him opened a world shrouded in books. Noelle quietly announced that this was the research club. Abel looked around. Amidst hundreds upon hundreds of volumes, an impressive sight. He asked where the other members were, and received an unexpected answer. Noelle bluntly told him that, at the moment, she was the club's sole member. Abel suspected the labyrinth circuit was the reason. He made his way to the shelves and began to randomly flip through the books. They were all ancient texts, clearly from many years ago. He asked what the oldest volume in the collection was. Noelle said with quiet regret that many magic texts had been burned during the Great Calamity. Abel fell silent as the fragments of history clicked into place in his mind. 200 years ago, sages defeated the Demon King, but peace was short-lived. Driven by a thirst for territory, humanity almost immediately plunged into a much longer war. And brutal one. 100 years of bloodshed. The lives it claimed far surpassed anything the Demon King had ever caused. Exhaustion and suffering gave way to a deep hatred of magic. A movement arose with the goal of eradicating magic from the world entirely. Countless precious magic tomes were reduced to ashes in the flames, and to uncover the secrets of ancient magic that had once far surpassed that which existed today. That was the purpose for which this research club existed. Abel thought it was an extraordinary motivation. He knew that, in this era, most people were no longer even capable of perceiving the decline of magic. Having recognized it and taken action was already exceptional. Noelle was surprised. She asked him why he wasn't mocking her like everyone else did. After all, most people thought magic tools were simply more practical. Abel deeply understood that frustration. In an environment like this, she had chosen to cling to and dedicate herself to ancient magic. She must have endured great loneliness and the burden of being misunderstood. So he told her with complete sincerity that he would never mock her efforts. Those words stirred something within Noelle. She asked his name in a soft voice, with a hint of shyness in her tone. Then she introduced herself formally and handed him the key to the room. She invited him to return the next day. There was something she wanted to show him. The next night arrived quickly. Abel found Ted asleep in the library, knowing that he had been exhausted by the clubs that had been hounding him for days. He didn't have the heart to wake him. He left alone, but Elise stopped him in the corridor. She nervously asked him what research club he was thinking of joining. When she learned that he hadn't decided yet, she gathered her courage and made an invitation. She admitted that she had always longed to experience the thrill of riding a flying dragon. A pang of nostalgia stirred within Abel too. Ever since he had reincarnated, he hadn't yet seen any dragons in this era, so he agreed to go with her to take a look. Elise lit up instantly. She asked him several times to make sure and then skipped away joyfully. Abel couldn't help but think that she really should make more friends. Afterwards, he headed to the Ancient Magic Research Club, but at the door, he sensed a familiar presence. It was Professor Amazon. Abel got straight to the point and asked her what she was doing there. Amazon smiled and said she was the club's advisor, and quickly added that she only dropped by occasionally. That over-explanation only heightened Abel's suspicions. Amazon turned the question around and asked him why he was there. Abel said he had a prior appointment with someone. Amazon raised an eyebrow with an expression denoting significant undertones, and cryptically let slip that Noelle was a genius personally recommended by the principal. In just 1 year, she had been granted exemption from all standard classes, and was studying on her own there, as most professors' courses no longer met her needs. That said, he suggested Abel apply for the same exemption. Abel immediately refused. He reiterated that all he wanted was a quiet, uneventful school life. But Amazon's smile suddenly faded, and he pointed out the contradiction. As long as Abel associated with Noelle, tranquility and calm would never come. Abel argued that he was simply interested in the book collection. Ama-sen insisted, pointing out the inconsistency in his behavior. If he truly yearned for calm, why would he be interested in ancient magic at all? Ama-sen slowly moved closer, reaching out as if to touch Abel's cheek. But in the end, he only gave him a pat on the shoulder. His tone, however, returned to its usual lightness, and he turned to leave with a smile. Abel stood there alone with a decidedly strange feeling. He silently activated his analytic eye. A tiny magic rune appeared on his shoulder, a listening device. He raised his hand and crushed it without a second's hesitation. Amazen, wherever he was, smiled knowingly. He had discovered it, just as he had expected. Abel pushed open the door and entered the research club. Noelle was reading silently. When she saw him arrive, she immediately put down her book and quietly said that she had been waiting for him with strangely direct frankness. A faint sense of something passed through Abel. Was that a kind thing to say? He brought up their agreement and asked what it was she wanted to show him. Noelle carefully and deliberately lifted a wooden box with her hands. From within it, she withdrew an ancient, old, and damaged book. Abel could see at a glance that it was sealed under layers of powerful runes. Noelle said that her family called it the Forbidden Grimoire. Abel recalled what the history books related, that this text held power capable of shaking the world during the era of the Great Calamity. It had been the spark that ignited conflict on more than one occasion. He asked why she was showing him something so dangerous. Noelle said that she had heard he might want to see it, so she had brought it. Abel recognized the book's immense value and began to harbor new suspicions about her lineage. Noelle undid the seals, saying it was a treasure she only showed him. Abel leaned in to examine it. The pages were inscribed with extraordinarily complex magic formulas. Even in its deteriorated state, the level of craftsmanship was undoubtedly high. He quickly turned the pages, and the handwriting too seemed strangely familiar, until he saw the inscription to my dearest comrade, Dodona. He froze. A storm raged within him. He asked if this book was a relic left by one of her ancestors. Nola felt it and said her ancestor had received it from a mage they deeply respected. She asked if he could understand it. Abel gave a seemingly modest answer. Internally, he felt nothing but uneasy, for this book had been written by his own hand. He pointed to the pages and gave a cursory explanation of what was written. As he spoke, he silently observed her reactions on her face. The crease of her forehead and her eyes gradually superimposed themselves onto a long-forgotten face. He was sure now, Noelle was a descendant of Dodona, the water hero. Noelle listened in complete absorption, pure joy spreading across her face. She begged him to tell her more about the book's secrets, but Abel already had plans for the next day. He took a chance and proposed a deal. If she let him use this research room, he would return in his free time and continue reading the grimoire with her. Noelle accepted the terms and smiled with genuine happiness. The next day, Abel and Elise arrived at the dragon stables. A single voice welcomed everyone with a theatrical flair. Next, a procession of elegantly attired youths with a sweet scent filed in behind her. Everyone froze. This frivolous, idol-like spectacle stood before them. Apparently, this was the legendary Dragon Rider Research Club. Abel couldn't begin to associate these people with dragons in any way. Caring for dragons had once been a grueling job that demanded extraordinary patience and strength. Elise looked regretful, as she had no idea the club would be like this. Then, a girl asked what differentiated this club from the one next door. The upperclassman cheerfully explained that this one was much more relaxed. It was about having fun. Abel understood immediately and felt a slight twinge of surprise at the same time. In the era he came from, dragons were valuable strategic assets, and powerful ones. It seemed that, after 200 years, the world had truly become prosperous. The senior announced that they would ride in pairs. Abel immediately sensed something was amiss. All the girls in the room were enthusiastically surrounded by boys, and he started to get a headache. Sacred creatures used as props for flirting. The upperclassman walked directly towards Elise and called her name with warm enthusiasm. Elise quickly slipped behind Abel, saying she already had a partner. The upperclassman's gaze immediately fell on Abel, cold and disgusted. He pushed between the two and invited Elise to come with him, but Elise clung to Abel's arm and insisted that she wanted to go with him. The senior smiled and dismissed her, saying it was too dangerous to take two beginners on the same dragon. Elise found herself in a difficult situation, her eyes filled with conflicting disappointment. Abel could see how much she longed to ride. He suppressed his own discomfort. He gently told her not to worry about him, to go and enjoy herself to the fullest. But that display of consideration infuriated Elise. She turned away. She accepted the senior's invitation with a huff and stopped looking at him. Abel was genuinely bewildered, unable to understand how he had managed to upset her. As they entered the dragon stables, that strong, familiar smell immediately invaded him. The senior proudly showed Abel his prized dragon. Its massive body was impressive. Elise exclaimed in awe and delight. It was the largest dragon she had ever seen. Abel was also silently impressed. This dragon had been raised magnificently. In his day, only members of the highest nobility could own a beast of such magnitude. It seemed that, after 200 years, humanity's ability to raise dragons had increased considerably. The elder told Abel that his dragon was in the back room. Then he took Elise to enjoy their sky ride. Elise cast one last glance at him before following him. The other visitors also gradually departed. The dragon stables fell silent, and Abel was the only one left. He walked alone towards the building's innermost recesses, ready to meet the dragon assigned to him. Just then, a voice behind him urgently called out. The person warned him not to approach that room under any circumstances, because the dragon inside, Reinhardt, harbored a special hatred for humans. A young boy apologized for his abruptness and introduced himself as a novice caretaker working there. Abel said it was all right, and that he simply wanted to meet the dragon as soon as possible. The boy opened the door slightly and said that seeing it with his own eyes would convey the danger better than words. Abel saw a massive red dragon, scarred around its eyes, radiating an arrogant authority, and immediately felt a surge of admiration. It was a magnificent dragon. The boy explained that it was named Reinhardt and was over 100 years old. It had once been a famous racing dragon, but after its caretaker's death, it refused to submit to anyone. Most people advocated for getting rid of it, but the boy had strongly opposed, because younger dragons revered it, and its presence helped maintain stability in the stable. Abel understood that, in the past, dragons only respected those who possessed true strength. For an elder dragon to inspire such esteem, its power should not be underestimated. Perhaps it had simply grown tired of being handled by those unworthy of it, and had decided to hide its strength. Abel called it by its name with quiet solemnity and extended his hand, indicating for Reinhardt to look at him. The boy panicked at the sight and rushed to stop what seemed like a suicidal gesture. Abel told him to stand still and say nothing. Reinhardt raised its proud head, its eyes gleaming with an inquisitive light. Abel read the silent plea within them and asked if it wanted to go for a ride. He gathered a concentrated sphere of pure magic in his palm and extended it for the great dragon to see. Reinhardt narrowed its eyes and observed for a moment, then slowly it lowered itself. That act of submission left the boy completely speechless. Abel gently told him that perhaps he should consider giving the person before him a chance. Reinhardt looked at the boy, and for a moment its gaze seemed to soften. The boy, overwhelmed with emotion, urgently asked who is Abel. Abel only said that he was a student and that he had borrowed Reinhardt in the valley. Several flying dragons carried students on a leisurely gliding flight. The upperclassmen led Elise to land on a quiet stretch of grass. As she gazed at the royal capital and the academy, which looked tiny below, she was awestruck. She found herself thinking that it would have been much better if Abel were there by her side. The upperclassman handed her a cup of tea, with a smile that concealed something barely disguised. Elise suspected nothing, thanked him, and drank, but then the senior suddenly hugged her from behind. She startled and dropped the teacup. She harshly demanded he tell her what he thought he was doing, and slapped him hard, fury burning within her. But the senior had the audacity to twist the situation, claiming that she had come there with ill intentions from the start. Next, he used foul language to slander her relationship with Abel. Elise's fury erupted completely. She summoned her magic, ready to defend herself, but a violent wave of dizziness hit her head-on. She fell to the ground, defenseless, and instantly understood that she had been drugged. The upperclassman smugly boasted about his excellent grades in potions class. He looked down at her as she was unable to resist anything, and let a satisfied smile form on his face. Elise could only lie there as he approached. At that very moment, Abel was already soaring over the valley on Reinhardt's back. He observed the valley spread out beneath him, only to discover that most students were engrossed in their own romantic pursuits. His gaze swept across a patch of grass and stopped dead. The upperclassman was approaching Elise, who lay there struggling, unable to resist. Elise's face was streaked with tears as she screamed Abel's name with all her might. The upperclassman scoffed, saying that the dragon Abel had borrowed was the most untamable in the stables. He spat that a man with inferior eyes would have probably already rushed to his death by now. Elise screamed at him with all the rage she had left, calling him exactly what he was. The senior told her to use a sweeter voice. He reached out without hesitation. He threatened her to behave and obey. Fear completely took hold of her. She could only scream Abel's name repeatedly. At that very instant, A hand grabbed the upperclassman by the hair. Abel's voice was icy cold, asking if that constituted a violation of the Academy's rules. Elise looked at him, and the tears she had been holding back from pain and lingering terror finally spilled over. The upperclassman struggled free in panic. Abel bluntly told him that what he had done was assault. The upperclassman tried to talk his way out of it, his heart pounding. He pointed at Elise, saying that she had wanted it too. Harrow Evo defended her without question. She would never stoop to being with someone like him. Those words pierced the darkness like a beam of light, and her tears finally burst forth. Humiliated and furious, the upperclassman pulled out his magic tool and unleashed a string of curses. He yelled that he would reduce them both to ashes. A searing bolt of fire lunged roaring towards them, but Reinhardt's broad wing effortlessly deflected it. Abel leaped lightly upward, reinforcing Reinhardt with a defensive enhancement spell. Reinhardt filled with energy, and a single flap shattered all the attacks in one fell swoop. Abel landed behind the senior like a phantom. The senior turned in panic, but his hand was already caught in Abel's iron grip. After a brief incantation, the runes that crisscrossed the magic cannon's barrel darkened and went out. The senior pulled the trigger in vain, and in a fit of desperate rage, summoned his own flying dragon and commanded it to attack. The dragon, named Holy Light, hesitated for a moment before reluctantly taking flight. Just as it prepared to dive, Reinhardt under a massive paw with a thunderous stomp. The authority of an unseen dragon spread around it, immobilizing both the elder and his dragon. Then came an even more astonishing sight. Reinhardt moved of its own accord, spreading its enormous wings. It protectively enveloped Abel, keeping him close beneath them. The warning and majesty of its gaze stripped Holy Light of any will to fight. The dragon even turned against its own target and grabbed its own master, who screamed in panic. It took flight without looking back, fleeing the sky entirely, ignoring the veteran's frantic shouts. Once the danger had passed, Elise could no longer hold back and threw herself into Abel's arms. On the way back, she sat on Reinhardt's back and let the smile return to her face. Abel sighed silently, relieved that the terrible memories hadn't managed to take root in her. He took the opportunity to glance around and check if any other undesirables were still down there. Then suddenly, Elise shouted in his ear, wishing time would stop right there. But Abel's mind wandered elsewhere, truly contemplating the magic of time. As Elise, leaning on his shoulder, was already falling asleep, she murmured something without thinking, that he was truly, really handsome. Abel didn't understand and asked her to repeat it, but he only got her nervous silence, and Reinhardt carried them both forward, gliding smoothly through the golden sunset light. Abel's story is about a person who saved the world, but ended up being unnecessary in it. He was betrayed, forgotten, and after 200 years returns to a future where his legendary power is now seen as weakness. However, even in a world that has declined, he is still someone capable of changing the rules. What makes this story interesting is not just the protagonist's power, but the contrast. Before, they feared him like a monster, and now they mock him as if he were worthless. But we know the truth. His power never disappeared. It's just waiting for the right moment. There is nostalgia here, progressive power development, and very well-achieved human moments, like Lilith's loyalty, who waited for him for over 100 years, or the scene with the dragon, where everything is understood without words. But not everything is perfect. Sometimes the story feels a bit slow, some moments turn out to be too familiar, and the behavior of certain characters can seem predictable. If you've already seen many stories of this type, some parts may feel repetitive. Still, there's something captivating, an atmosphere of quiet power where the protagonist doesn't need to flaunt his strength. He simply demonstrates it with his actions. Do you think Avel will manage to change this world, or will he end up becoming its enemy again? Write your opinion in the comments, like if you want to see more content, and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Thanks for watching the video.